Corinthians chapter 2. We're going to jump back in our study of information overload. Last week we got into the eye. We talked about the fact that the eye, it's practical, and how the devil tries to use all of that to try to derail us a lot of times in our walk with God, and how he tries to get our attention here, there, and everywhere else, just like he did with Eve. And we'll talk about that. But 1 Corinthians chapter number 2, we want to read our text verses, and the Bible says, "But as it is written, eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither have entered into the heart of man the things which God hath prepared for them that love him, but God hath revealed them unto us by his Spirit, for the Spirit searcheth all things, yea, the deep things of God." And of course, for this side of the ledger over here, we're jumping over and we're using the experience of the fall of man over in Genesis chapter 3, and it's kind of where we're getting Satan's game plan, how the things that he uses and how he uses them. We see his MO, his modus operandi here in this first, really for the first 7 or 8 verses in chapter number 3. And of course, last week we kind of zeroed in here on chapter 3, verse number 6. Well, we talked about, when we're talking about the eye, and when the woman saw, and that's kind of what we talked about yesterday or last week, the practicality of the things that Satan uses to garner our attention, to draw us away from the things that God has in store for us, away from the path that God has for our life and everything. And if we're not careful, we will find ourselves veering off of that path and chasing after something that may be practical. I'm not saying that everything that Satan throws out in front of us, a lot of times, I'm not saying it's all bad, because there's still a lot of good things out there that just snag us and kind of just pull us back and keep us from reaching that full potential as Christians that God has in store for us in our walk with him. So like I said last week, we talked about the practicality of everything that he uses, and how that it can be something just normal. It doesn't have to be anything grossly, over the top. I mean, he does use those types of things to ensnare and keep people. But for the most part, even for the Christian, it can be something just simple, something practical. But also, along with that, with the thought of it's practical, it has to be palatable. And I might be stretching here a little bit just to try to keep the alliteration going with the I and the P, with it's palatable. But if you understand what the word palatable means, it means something, obviously, that tastes good, if we're talking about a food. But we can also kind of stretch that into the meaning of that whatever it is that Satan puts in front of us to try to catch our eye and to pull our attention away from what the path that God has for us, that we're walking and serving him, the things that he does for him to get us to see where he's going and then to intentionally go in that direction. It has to be something that is palatable to us, something that we would want. I know, for generality's sake, we've kind of been talking about and using the example of, car lots and stuff. And I'm going to kind of stay in that vein a little bit here, with kind of drawing off of that thought, because the reason, like I said, that it's not bad for us to have a vehicle. It's not bad to want a new vehicle or anything else, because they're practical. But if that vehicle is going to put us in a position to where, it's going to, and I've been there, I've done the stupid stuff, I kind of know what I'm talking about in that aspect of life. But, when it comes right down to it, I mean, it's practical. It's not bad for us to need or to want a new vehicle, but we also have it for us to be able to get into that path to where then he can take the opportunity that God might have for us in either keeping what we got or having another vehicle in mind, and we want the shiny one over here. We have to be okay with what the cost is going to be that it's going to bring us to get us to want to take this vehicle that might be a little bit outside our price range. They can get us financed, but we're going to have to finance it for 25 years to get a payment down to where they don't do that, obviously, but, just throwing the extremes out. But, a lot of times we will. And I had a guy that, of all things, a few years ago, I really wanted a Challenger. And I stopped to buy, we was driving through Oak Ridge, and I'd seen this blue one. Oh, man, it was pretty. It was blue one out in Secret City, Dodge, And we rolled in there one night right before, it was probably 45 minutes before they closed, and it was dark, obviously, but we was out there kind of walking around looking at it, and the salesman came walking by, and he just kind of said, hey, asked us about the car. We said, we're just looking and everything, and he kind of went on by. Well, it wasn't just a few minutes. Here he came back with the key to this car. And because he saw which one I was looking at, and it came to find out it's a guy that used to work where I work, and he used to deliver to Lori's store at one point in time, and so we kind of knew each other. Well, he let us take it out for a test drive. I run it up the road and back, and I liked it. And then when we got back, he was kind of just, chit-chatting about, if we wanted to make a deal. I said, I'll have to think about it, because I got to looking at it, and the car, they had it priced for a different type of car than what it was, trim package and stuff. And I told him that. But that night before we left, he was bragging to me about a deal that he had worked on earlier that day with a woman that had came in, and she wanted this, what's the top of the line Jeep? No, not the Wrangler, Rubicon. She really they had this Rubicon on the lot, and she really, really wanted it. And we were just kind of chit-chatting back and forth and stuff. And he told me, he said, a lot of these people, they come in. Now, later he's trying to sell me a car after telling me his sales pitch and how he goes about it. And I'm like, dude, I ain't buying a car from you. You was the last car salesman on the earth, because I know what you're going to do to me. Okay. You done told me. But I guess he forgot because he talks to so many people. But anyway, he's trying to get me to buy this car, or he's telling me about this lady wanting to buy this Jeep. And he says, yeah, he said, man, he said, their big question is, well, what are you comfortable paying? That's, that's tipping your hand. You're willing to overpay for a vehicle if they can get you in a payment that you want, or that you think you can afford. And then they slipped by the fact, and he slipped by the fact that he had financed this lady for 96 months to get her into a payment for this Jeep that she wanted. That's kind of what we're talking about. That's what Satan does to us. That is exactly what Satan did here in Genesis 3. In the fact that she wanted it. She was okay overpaying for this Jeep and everything else because she wanted it, and she didn't care how long she had to pay for it, as long as he got her into a payment that she was happy with. Satan, because it's palatable, because it was within what she wanted, she got it. So like I said, when it comes to the things of anything being palatable, it means it's something that he can dangle out in front of us, that as long as we're okay with it, then he's got us hook, line, and sinker, and then off we go. And before long, we'll find ourselves in a position to where we're so far out and so far away that you've ever heard the statement, sin will take you further than you ever thought you would go. I mean, you talk to a lot of people that used to go to church and used to be faithful and different things like that. And then they start missing a little here and they start missing a little there. And then before you know it, you ain't seen them in forever. And then when you see them again, you see the marks of sin on their life. That is a real thing. But anyway, if you ask that person, would you have ever thought you'd have got, sin would have took you this far? They'd say no. But they're so far out, and I've had this happen in my family. I keep using a lot of examples with my family because I know my family, and I don't mean to bore you all with a lot of this, but a lot of these things kind of fit, and this is one of them. My uncle on my dad's side of the family, a lot of them used to come to church here. And he was a deacon in this church when me and Lori got married and we came back to church here. He's one of the reasons that I'm a deacon in the church today because of some things that had happened and some things that I had told him that if, and I still to this day don't care what happened. But, and because of my answer to that situation, he's seen that I had the mentality to be a deacon. So when they were looking to try to add a couple more, because we had a couple of older deacons that were looking at, either resigning, kind of coming out of active duty or just possibly dying off soon, not to be not to be bringing death into this, but Aiden's teaching on death down there in his class, so we'll just kind of throw that in there too. And happy Halloween. So anyway, no, Aiden's drawing up a nice little graveyard down there on his whiteboard. But anyway, but I guess because of the way that I told him, we had this conversation right out here in front of the church that night. And I told him, I said, Lawrence, the thing is, it's none of my business. If the lady ever come to me and tried to explain, I'm going to be like, no, that's none of my business. I don't need to know that. And because of the way that I answered that kind of, they decided to look to me and put me on as a deacon here in the church. But it wasn't just a few years after that he started going down, and looking back on it now, I can see how things started matriculating in his life after that incident that happened within the church. And I seen how, because he started becoming accusatory towards me and against the pastor at the time and different things like that, and accused me and him of conspiring. And me and Lori at the time, we'd come and sit and talk to the preacher before church in the mornings and the evenings on Wednesday nights, whenever, we'd get here early and just sit and talk, And he accused me and the pastor of sitting in there and me telling everything that the pastor just happened to be preaching on was falling right in his lap. And he accused me and him of conspiring to make him look bad to the church. And it caught me and the pastor completely and totally off guard. And I'm like, and we were both like, what are you talking about? We don't talk about you. But God was speaking through the preacher in such a way that he had to find some reason for God to be speaking through the preacher, because it was, everything for the last 2 or 3 Sundays had been landing right in his lap, and he had no way to figure out how to deal with it. So the way he would deal with it was he lashed out against me and the pastor, because I supposedly knew all this stuff that was going on in his life, and I didn't. Still don't care. None of my business. But, it comes down to the simple fact that because all of that was hitting him, he decided it was time for him to hit the high road and leave. Well, what happened shortly after that He had just bought a motorcycle, and him and his wife would go riding motorcycles. Well, then shortly after that, she wanted a motorcycle. Now they've done left the church, and he buys her motorcycle. She goes and takes the course to learn it, and then they're somewhere up in the mountains riding around. I don't remember. I might have been up on the Dragon. I don't know, but they're up in the mountains riding around on one of them curvy roads, and she come around the curve and hit some loose gravel, and the bike slid, and she went with it and almost hit a car head on, sliding across the road, and wound up losing her right leg. You would think after not being in church, as long as you've been in church and studying the Bible, as long as you studied the Bible and all this, that, and other, you would think that would have been a wake-up call, but it wasn't. He still ain't in church, still has no desire to go to church. None of his family's in church. This is all my family. But none of his immediate family is in church. Neither one of his boys go to church or nothing. And the pastor, before he left at the time, he saw, and this has been like 3 or 4 or 5 years later, he's seen him, he run into him somewhere, the mall or something. And after the pastor at the time had seen him, he came back and he asked me, he said, "Have you seen your uncle?" I said, "Not in a while." "Why?" And he goes, "Man, I'm telling you," he said, "the marks of sin." He said, "He looks like he's aged 20 years in just 5. The marks of sin will do that to you. You know, so what I'm saying is that for Satan to get us to become palatable to the sin and the temptations that he's dangling out in front of us, it has to be something that we're willing to partake in. You see that over in Genesis 3. And like I said last week, we talked about, and when the woman saw, when she saw what? That the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desired to make one wise. So here we see that he's now come in. Satan's now come into the garden. He's been watching. He's obviously been watching what goes on, because the Bible tells us that he goes to and fro in the earth looking for those that he can take, looking for those he can trip up in sin, looking for those that's the most vulnerable. And just like he did with Christ, when Christ had just been baptized, the Holy Spirit had just descended upon Christ in the form of a dove and everything else, and Christ is fixing to start his earthly ministry. What happens is Christ withdraws himself and goes into the wilderness, and we all know this, went into the wilderness, and we've talked about it, and fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. And at Christ's weakest point in human flesh, Satan comes and tempts him not once, not twice, but 3 times. And you can find those accounts over in Matthew, probably chapter 3 or 4, Luke 4, I think, and I think Mark does touch on it a little bit, probably around chapter 2, 3, something like that. But anyway, like I said, that account's there. It's in the Bible. And the reason for that is Christ is letting us know that even in the weakest form, now he still had to deal with the flesh. He was God in flesh. Okay? I mean, he did not set aside his deity to take on everything that we do, but he also did not set aside all of the humanistic things that we deal with, because he's God. He experienced a lot of the things that we experience and everything else, and he knew what it was to be hungered. He knew what it was to be tired, because the Bible tells us that he had to withdraw himself and get rest and move and kind of leave the ministry, leave the crowds, and go over here and get some peace and quiet and some rest. What happens if you look in John chapter number 4? What happens there is he comes, they're traveling, and he says, I must needs go to Samaria. Now, Jews had nothing to do with the Samaritans. The Bible tells us that. But he had to go through Samaria to get where he was going. And where do we find Christ when the woman from the city of Samaria comes to the well in the middle of the day? He's seated at Jacob's well. What are you doing when you're sitting? You're resting, right? The Bible plainly shows us right there that Christ, through the journey, was wearied and he needed an opportunity to rest. And he sent the disciples into the town to buy food and some supplies and stuff like that. And then they come back and they're all worried about his fleshly hunger and everything. They knew he was tired because they were worried about him, and they're trying to get him to eat because he needed his strength. Okay, just like we do. That's why we like to eat. We want our strength, to be able to live and carry on. And that's what the disciples knew, that Christ needed some strength to finish the journey. But yet, what did Christ tell them when he showed up? He said, I have meat to eat that you know not of. Because he said, look up. He told them to look, the field is white unto harvest. Because this lady that he had met at the well had went into town and told everybody in town about this man who is this not the Christ, is what she said. And all the city, a lot of them started coming out because they was wanting to see what the stir was that she was making and everything else. And here they all come out to the town, come out to see him and everything. So we know that Christ got tired, he got weary, because he was in the same flesh that you and I are in, that we live in. This body gets tired. It gets weary. For the majority of us today, we're going to go home and probably take a Sunday afternoon nap after we eat lunch. I'll be going to bed after I eat Sunday lunch because I'll have to be up at midnight to go to work tonight. So that's my lot in life. But anyway, I will be going to bed, not to take a nap, but I will be going to bed to go to bed because, I'll have to be able to stay awake to driving the truck all day tomorrow. But that's just the way it is. So we see here, all of this is palatable. Satan is throwing things out in front of us to try to get us to decide this, I want this more than this. Give this illustration. I know we've been talking about cars a little bit, but I know a preacher who at one point in time, he I keep getting strange looks. I'm kind of worried. But anyway, I know a preacher who, he's an older preacher, so we're going back a few years and decades on cars. But back in the 70s, early 70s, there was a car that Ford had that was very popular. Actually, it had its own TV show called Starsky and Hutch, Gran Torino. That this pastor, all his buddies had one, and he wanted one. And he had to have it, and God wouldn't let him get one. But all his buddies did. So what did he do? He said, I don't care. I don't need you, God. I'm going to go buy it. He went and bought the car that he wanted so he could be like his buddies. And he told me, he said, that was the worst decision I ever made in my life. It was palatable. It was practical. But for the simple fact that he went outside of God's will, made it wrong. So therefore, that car, I think he said, stayed in the shop more than he got to drive it. He's having to make payments on the car, and he's having to pay to keep it fixed. That's not a fun place to be. Been there and done that, got the t-shirt, all that stuff. But anyway, like I said, so finally after some time, God finally let him get rid of that car. After God had taught him a lesson. And I know all about lessons with vehicles. I had a Camaro that I liked. And every time I would drive it, it would leave me stranded on the road. But then when I got done leasing the truck that I had leased, I drove that car, hardly had any problems out of it for a year and a half before I traded it for a pickup truck. I know all about this stuff. That car sat, it was a driveway ornament. It just sat there. I couldn't even drive. I couldn't even make it around the subdivision we lived in without it trying to break down on me. That's how much I'm done. Wasn't anything wrong with me getting the car. It was practical, and I wanted it, and I was willing to pay the price to get it, and I did. And God showed me that He was willing to teach me a lesson, and I would like to say I learned that lesson, but no, I finally learned it with Big Whitey, and now my pickup truck. I'm sorry, that's what I always called it. I'm sorry. I have nicknames for the vehicles, and no, it's a big white Ford pickup truck, so it fits, and that's what I call it. No, but anyway, I bought that truck, and for 6 years, I regretted that thing, and I had to make payments on it, but I had to keep it, and I had to drive it, and I almost get it paid off, and then I got to buy Bubba his yellow truck, and I bought it, refinanced it again, and then the day before I make the final payment on that truck, the engine blows up. I'm not saying that had anything to do with the lesson, but I'm just saying that's what happened. The engine blew up, and now it's sitting at Ray Varner, and I'm waiting. I'm hoping they get it back. But like I said, when it comes to things being palatable, Satan's always going to throw something out in front of us that we want. Just like I said, here in this verse, I think Eve was hungry. He had been watching her. He knew what time she would come out and get food for her and Adam. And I think that he saw her. He knew she was probably hungry. And he used that as his advantage to trick her into seeing beyond what she should have done because the fruit was palatable. It was good for food. The Bible tells us that right there in chapter 3, verse 6. And was good for food, and it was pleasant to the eyes. The palatableness of sin is always going to be pleasant to your eyes. So, all right, we'll pick up there next week and continue on.